Jay Silverheels' story is one filled with both triumph and pain. He was born Harold J. Smith on May 26, 1912, on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve near Hagersville, Ontario. He was one of at least 10 children born into a large Mohawk family that struggled to make ends meet. His father, Alexander George Edwin Smith, had been a war hero who earned the Military Cross for bravery in World War I. But when he came home, the war had changed him forever. The artillery left him nearly deaf, and he spent the rest of his life in pain, surviving on just $49 a month from the government. His medals might have proved his bravery, but they didn't put food on the table. His wife Mabel, who was part Mohawk and part Seneca, worked endlessly to keep the family going. Doctors often refused to see them because they were indigenous, so she relied on traditional medicine and herbal remedies passed down through generations. Poverty was part of their lives from the very beginning. Even as a child, Harold showed incredible athletic ability. At just 5 years old, he was already racing around the reserve in local lacrosse games. By 19, he was playing professionally for the Toronto Tecumsehs, using the name Harry Smith. He wasn't alone in his success. His cousins and brothers, who went by the nicknames Porky, Beef, and Chubby, played alongside him. They traveled across cities like Buffalo, Rochester, and Atlantic City, earning small amounts of money and trying to escape the cycle of poverty. During one game, Harold's speed was so remarkable that someone shouted, "It looked like his shoes were flashing silver." From that moment, the name Silverheels stuck. Newspapers began calling him that, and fans came out just to see him play. He became a star in the lacrosse world, scoring more than 4 goals a game at his peak. But athletic fame didn't mean freedom. The world he lived in treated Indigenous people unfairly. In Canada, residential schools were still operating, designed to erase Indigenous identity and language. On his reserve, children were punished or beaten for speaking Mohawk. Some were forced to wash their mouths with soap if they spoke their language. One of Harold's sisters was sent to a residential school and came back barely able to speak Mohawk anymore. The system tried to erase who they were. Government officials called Indigenous people lazy, uneducated, and incapable. That message wasn't just in reports. It was in the way people treated them every day. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, life got even harder. Harold's family moved to Buffalo, where he took any job he could find. Farm labor, odd work, whatever was available. His father could barely move without pain, and his mother traded away family heirlooms for food. The government's rations were often spoiled or inedible. Still, Harold pushed forward. His speed on the lacrosse field helped him earn money, and by 1932 he was being paid $75 a game, a fortune at the time. He was known for being fierce, and when a fight broke out during a game in Montreal, he was suspended for throwing punches. But when he returned, ticket sales tripled. People wanted to see him in action. When lacrosse slowed down, he tried his hand at boxing. He fought as a middleweight in the Golden Gloves tournament at Madison Square Garden and made it all the way to the semifinals. But one powerful punch broke his jaw in 2 places, ending his boxing career. Even then, he didn't give up. He lived on a liquid diet for weeks and used the prize money to stay afloat. The injury taught him resilience, something that would carry him through life. In 1937, while touring Los Angeles with his lacrosse team, Harold's life changed. A comedian named Joe E. Brown spotted him sprinting across the field and offered him a small film role. He performed a dangerous stunt that took 11 takes to perfect, and he earned $150, twice what lacrosse paid. From that moment, he decided to stay in Hollywood. He got a Screen Actors Guild card and began calling himself Jay Silverheels. By the end of that year, he had appeared in 5 films. He wasn't famous yet, but he was determined to make it. Hollywood in the 1930s wasn't welcoming to Indigenous actors. Jay often worked as a stuntman, earning less than $20 a day and bussing tables at night just to survive. In 1939, he landed a real acting role in Drums Along the Mohawk, which paid $350 a week, more money than he had ever earned. Studio executives liked his new name and said it sounded exotic. He didn't have much choice but to agree. For years, he took on minor roles, often as nameless Indian characters. Directors made him strip to the waist for authenticity, treating him more like a prop than a person. But he never gave up. He learned his lines, studied acting, and even began reading Shakespeare because a friend told him that if he could understand Shakespeare, he could understand anything. He served briefly in World War II and returned to Hollywood afterward, determined to rebuild his acting career. But things hadn't changed. Indigenous actors were still overlooked for major roles, which often went to white actors wearing brown makeup. Jay kept working, taking whatever parts he could get. In 1948, his persistence finally paid off when he was cast in Key Largo alongside Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. For the first time, his name appeared in the credits of a major studio film. It was a turning point. 2 years later, he played Geronimo in Broken Arrow, a Western that tried to portray Native Americans more respectfully. Jay's performance brought dignity to the role, but the film still starred a white actor, Jeff Chandler, as an Apache leader in dark makeup. Even when Hollywood wanted to seem progressive, it couldn't give indigenous people their rightful place. Everything changed for Jay Silverheels in 1949 when he was cast as Tonto in The Lone Ranger on ABC. He beat out 35 other actors for the part, becoming the first Native American to play a Native character on television. For years, the role had been voiced by white men on radio, but Jay's casting marked a breakthrough in representation. Unfortunately, that victory came with painful compromises. The name Tonto means fool or stupid in Spanish, and Jay knew it. He hated it but had no power to change it. In public, he smiled through interviews, but privately he felt humiliated. When someone asked him in 1957 about his role, he answered bluntly, "Tonto is stupid." Those 3 words revealed years of quiet frustration. Jay often changed his lines during filming. The dialogue given to him was filled with broken English, designed to make Tonto sound less intelligent. Jay knew real people didn't talk that way, so he ad-libbed his lines to make them sound more natural. Directors hated it, but Clayton Moore, the actor who played the Lone Ranger, stood up for him and told them to let Jay do it his way. Working conditions on the set were harsh. The show's budget was low, and Jay and Moore didn't even have dressing rooms. They were forced to change clothes in a gas station bathroom nearby. The heavy costumes made of suede and wool turned scorching hot under the California sun. One day, Jay refused to continue until they provided proper dressing rooms. The next day, the studio built them. It was a small victory, but it mattered deeply. The show was a huge hit. The Lone Ranger ranked among the top programs on television, and Jay became a household name. But even as fame found him, inequality never left. He earned less than half of what his white co-star made, even though audiences loved him just as much. Some directors treated him poorly, and one even tried to physically attack him on set. Through it all, Jay kept his dignity, refusing to let anger define him. Despite the success, Jay felt trapped by the character. He was proud to represent his people on television, but he hated that Tonto spoke like a stereotype. Jay was fluent, intelligent, and articulate, yet the show forced him to sound simple and submissive. He knew what the world saw: a loyal sidekick who followed the white hero, and it bothered him deeply. The name that made him famous also became a burden he could never escape. In his later years, Jay used his fame to push for change. He spoke out about the lack of meaningful Native representation in film and television. He founded the Indian Actors Workshop in Hollywood to help young Native performers develop their craft and find better opportunities. He wanted them to have choices he never had, to play characters who were real, not caricatures. Jay Silverheels' life was filled with contrasts. On one hand, he achieved something no Native actor before him had done. He became a television star known across America. On the other hand, that success came at a personal cost. Behind his calm smile and steady voice was a man who carried the weight of generations of discrimination. He endured poverty, racism, and the constant reminder that in Hollywood, his worth was always measured against someone else's comfort. Yet he never stopped fighting. Every time he stepped on set, every time he delivered a line his own way, he quietly resisted the system that wanted to silence him. He showed strength not just in his roles, but in his refusal to give up. The world may have known him as Tonto, but those who truly understood his journey knew he was much more than a sidekick. Jay Silverheels was a trailblazer who opened doors for countless native actors after him, proving that talent and dignity could outshine prejudice. His legacy lives on not through the stereotypes that once limited him, but through the courage it took to stand tall in a world that tried to keep him small. Though the role of Tonto followed him for the rest of his life, Jay turned it into something greater. A symbol of quiet defiance, a reminder that behind every mask Hollywood created, there was a real person, proud of who he was and where he came from. In 1955, while practicing a fight scene, a stuntman accidentally fell onto Jay Silverheels. Clayton Moore, his co-star, quickly noticed something wasn't right. Jay's walk seemed uneven, and his face looked strained. Moore followed him to his trailer and found him clutching his chest in pain. Jay was having a heart attack. It was shocking, especially because he had once been an athlete, a champion lacrosse player, and even a boxer who had competed in the Golden Gloves. But Jay was also a heavy smoker, and the years of stress and hard work had taken their toll. He missed nearly 8 weeks of filming while he recovered. During that time, the writers had to come up with a reason for Tonto's absence, so they wrote that he was away in Washington, meeting the Great White Father. It was meant as a throwaway line, but it revealed how casually the show leaned on stereotypes that didn't reflect real native culture or dignity. Off-screen, Jay Silverheels was a very different man than the one audiences saw on TV. At home, he was still Harold Smith, the name he was born with. He had married Mary DeRoma in 1945, and they built a family together, raising 4 children, Jay Jr., Marilyn, Pamela, and Karen. From his first marriage to Bobby Smith, he had 2 more children, Steve and a daughter sometimes listed as Gail or Sharon. He often joked about their mixed heritage, once telling a story on The Tonight Show that he married an Italian woman to get back at Christopher Columbus, calling their children Indolans, a mix of Indian and Italian. But behind the humor was a deeper truth about his pride and frustration. Jay's grandfather had been a Mohawk chief, and he carried the strength of his culture even while working in an industry that didn't respect it. In 1953, Jay played the role of Setanta, a Kiowa chief, in the film War Arrow. It wasn't a leading role, but it placed him beside major Hollywood names like Maureen O'Hara and Jeff Chandler. The film was shot across Arizona and California in places like Nogales and Empire Ranch, and was originally filled with action scenes that later got replaced by long dialogue sequences. Even though critics said this weakened the movie, Jay's performance stood out. His character was once again placed on the opposite side of the white hero, showing how native roles were often used as background rather than central figures in Hollywood storytelling. The next year, in 1954, Jay appeared in Drums Across the River. He played a character named T.A. in a story about land disputes between settlers and the Ute tribe. The film starred Audie Murphy, who played a young man falsely accused of murder while trying to prevent war between the two groups. It was filmed in some of California's most beautiful landscapes, including Red Rock Canyon. Jay's role wasn't large, but it was powerful. His character symbolized the native voice in a world that rarely let indigenous people speak for themselves. The film had dramatic stunts, including one that critics called the leap of death. For Jay, who had once been a professional athlete, these demanding scenes came naturally. His physical strength and grace were part of what made him such a reliable actor in westerns. When the Lone Ranger TV series ended in 1957, Jay continued to appear in its 2 film versions, The Lone Ranger, 1956, and The Lone Ranger and The Lost City of Gold, 1958. Both movies did fine at the box office, though not spectacularly. But for Jay, the impact was deeper. Tonto had made him famous, but it also trapped him. From that point on, nearly every role he was offered was another version of the same character. Stoic, quiet, and speaking in broken English. The very role that made him a star also became a cage. Throughout the 1960s, Jay kept working in television. He appeared on shows like Wagon Train, Rawhide, Daniel Boone, Laramie, and The Virginian. Yet no matter where he went, he was cast as the same kind of character. Even when his performances were strong and sincere, he wasn't given the recognition he deserved. He appeared on Daniel Boone 3 times between 1964 and 1965, but his characters were barely given any meaningful lines. Despite being one of the most recognizable Native American actors in the country, he was still treated as a background figure. During the peak of The Lone Ranger, Jay earned about $100,000 per season, which would be around $850,000 today. It sounds impressive, but it was only half of what Clayton Moore was paid for the same show. That pay gap followed Jay for most of his career, reminding him of how deeply unfair Hollywood could be. As the 1960s moved forward, the world began to change. The Native American rights movement grew louder, and with it came criticism of old Hollywood portrayals. Activists and scholars started pointing out how characters like Tonto reinforced racist stereotypes. Some even used his name as an insult. One writer called Tonto an Indian Stepin Fetchit, comparing him to black characters created to entertain white audiences. Russell Means, a leader in the American Indian movement, used Tonto, the same way others used Uncle Tom, as a symbol of submission. Jay Silverheels found himself caught between two worlds. The character that had made him a household name was now seen by his own community as a betrayal. But Jay had never intended it that way. He had played the role with dignity, working within the limits of a system he couldn't control. Now he was faced with the painful reality that his greatest success was also a source of shame for others. Studios became nervous about casting him in new projects, fearing backlash, and his acting work began to dry up. Instead of fading into obscurity, Jay chose to create change from the inside. In the early 1960s, he co-founded the Indian Actors Workshop in Los Angeles. It began as a small effort at the Los Angeles Indian Center, supported by figures like Buffy Sainte-Marie, Iron Eyes Cody, and Rod Redwing. By 1966, it had become a respected training ground for Native actors, offering weekly classes in acting, stunt work, voice training, and even health education. One of its future students was Michael Horse, who decades later played Tonto in The Legend of the Lone Ranger, 1981, and gained fame in Twin Peaks. In a 1973 interview, Jay explained that the workshop's main goal was to unlock the dormant creativity inside Native communities. He didn't just talk about it, he built it. He believed that Native Americans could not wait for Hollywood to change. They had to prepare themselves to take the roles when the opportunity came. His approach wasn't about anger or protest, it was about preparation and empowerment. He often said that boycotts wouldn't work for Native actors because the industry wouldn't feel the financial pressure. So instead, he focused on creating skilled, confident professionals who could demand better roles from within the system. Not everyone agreed with his methods. Some activists believed he was being too patient, too cooperative with an industry that had always mocked Native culture. But Jay believed progress came from persistence, not shouting. He even led letter writing, campaigns to political leaders and TV executives, asking for fairer portrayals of Native Americans in media. By the 1970s, Jay had shifted much of his energy to harness racing, something he had always loved. He earned a provisional driver's license in 1974 and trained horses at Hollywood Park. His calm personality and athletic background made him a natural at the sport. He even went on tour promoting races on the East Coast, using his fame to attract audiences. One horse named Hi-Ho Silverheels, named in his honor, broke a track record in 1996, years after his death. His widow Mary and son Jay Jr. were there to celebrate the moment, honoring both his love of racing and his legacy. Sadly, Jay's later years were filled with health struggles. In 1975, just when Hollywood was finally starting to take Native representation seriously, Jay suffered a series of strokes that left him partially paralyzed. Another major stroke in 1976 made it hard for him to speak, but he still lived long enough to see one final recognition of his contribution to film. On July 17, 1979, he was awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, surrounded by Native dancers. His voice was weak, his words slurred, but his spirit was strong. He managed to whisper a few words of gratitude to the crowd. It was a quiet, emotional moment that symbolized a lifetime of struggle, strength, and perseverance. Jay Silverheels passed away on March 5, 1980, at the age of 67. He died from complications of a stroke and pneumonia at a hospital in Calabasas, California. His ashes were returned to his birthplace, the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, where his journey had begun decades earlier. His son, Jay Silverheels Jr., followed in his footsteps and became an actor. He even appeared in The Legend of the Lone Ranger in 1981. Unfortunately, that film became a disaster. Its production was plagued with problems, and the lead actor's voice had to be dubbed. It flopped at the box office, but Jay Jr. continued acting in television, carrying on his father's mission to represent Native people with pride and authenticity. When Jay founded the Indian Actors Workshop, he said its purpose was to awaken the dormant creativity of the Indians. His work helped shape a new generation of Native talent. The effects could be seen in the rise of Indigenous actors like Graham Greene, who earned an Oscar nomination for Dances with Wolves, and in groundbreaking Native-made films like Smoke Signals, 1998, the first feature written, directed, and produced entirely by Native Americans. Even after his death, Jay's name lived on. He was posthumously inducted into the Western Performers Hall of Fame in 1993 and into the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame in 1997 under the name Harry Tonto Smith. His portrait still hangs in Buffalo's Shays Performing Arts Center, a tribute to his enduring influence. Every Indigenous storyteller, actor, or filmmaker who fights for authentic representation walks through a door that Jay Silverheels helped open. Though he once admitted he cringed inside every time he had to deliver Tonto's broken English lines, Jay never let bitterness consume him. In 1969, appearing on The Tonight Show, he made light of it one last time. Dressed as Tonto, he looked directly into the camera and said with perfect comic timing, "My name is Tonto. I hail from Toronto, and I speak Esperanto." The audience roared with laughter, but beneath the humor was something more profound. A man reclaiming his voice, turning mockery into pride. Jay Silverheels had spent his life breaking barriers that others never even dared to approach, and though he suffered in silence for much of it, his legacy still speaks louder than words.